I thought you were going to give me easy questions. So I'm Kate Simpson. I'm the director of the Wasafiri Institute, and I'm the former managing director of Wasafiri as well. And my role is taking SystemCraft, which is our applied approach to creating system change in the face of complex, tough problems, and helping other people use it, helping resource leaders and practitioners to be able to go out in the world and make system change happen in the face of some of our most complex problems. And I sit here in the north of England, where it's very sunny today. As humans, we are naturally actually quite systemic thinkers. You know, we're used to like all the things that are really significant for us, like families and communities and organizations are systems. So I actually think that weirdly, you know, systems are what we're used to. So systems thinking is a way of, it's probably there's two probably big things I think that are a bit different to the way we're often taught to do things at work with systems thinking. System stuff asks us to look at the whole and sort of, you know, be okay with lots of things that are interconnected rather than trying to reduce them down to single things. So systems thinking say, oh, you know, can I hold this big interconnected stuff that, you know, where there's the, you know, if you think of your own organization, your own family, you know, it's the things that include like what people do and how people feel and the relationships between people and what matters to people. And systems thinking allows us to hold all of that together rather than just looking at kind of one part of an issue. And the other thing that I think systems thinking allows us to do is this concept of emergence, that things appear and that there's some sort of characteristic that the whole of a thing has that doesn't exist in any single part. So in an organization, classically, culture is one of those things that only exists in the whole. You can't go and find it in an office somewhere or written down on a piece of paper. So I think systems thinking helps us to see those things that aren't just kind of can't be reduced down to a single parts. And it's probably the difference between talking about our organizations as if they're machines and they're engineering problems and seeing ourselves, you know, when we're doing change as engineers, and thinking about our organizations as ecosystems of gardens and thinking of ourselves as gardeners. And when you're being an engineer, you try and take everything apart and you look at the problem and then you put different piece in and you put it all back together. And you hope that there's just one broken part or one part you want to change. And you know, it's all about breaking it down really for an engineer. When you're a gardener, what you actually do is you do two things. You look at the whole and go, well, how's this garden doing? You know, is it healthy? You ask questions like that. Is it healthy? Is it diverse? And then the things that you work on as a gardener is you work on the enabling conditions. You don't try and break it down and say, well, I'll just work on this one plant. You say, well, how well does the water move around in my garden? Does the sunlight get in? What's the soil like? I think it's because we're realizing that the really big things that matter in our world and the big challenges that we're facing, like climate change, like cost of living crisis, like biodiversity loss, you know, like kind of some of the challenges around diversity and inclusion, these are all complex, interconnected issues. They don't you can't break them down like an engineer and say, oh, well, if we change one bit over here, it'll all work. They're really there's just masses of interconnections in there, and we have to work at that, you know, be able to hold that interconnectedness. I think we have to also be able to say these problems that we've got have emerged not by accident. They've actually emerged from systems, sets of relationships and dynamics and incentives and policies that actually are working, and they're working for, you know, certain interests, certain, you know, the climate change is driven by all the benefits of a really carbon intensive fuels and the things that that gives us. So we have to recognize that the problems we face are actually products of the systems, the organizations, the economies, the societies we've built, and that those need to change if we're going to tackle these sort of you know, these existential challenges, these big complex challenges that we face. So I think it's needed if we're going to be able to take those things on. I think for the private sector, I think one of the challenges I see is often private sector organizations, they don't have a mandate or they don't see themselves as owning a systemic problem. They're not saying, oh, biodiversity loss is our problem. Now they're impacted by that problem, but their mandate feels different around that issue, which is one of the reasons I think that it's a less comfortable fit. That said, I work with a lot of private sector leaders who are finding a systems approach really, really useful. And, this is generally when they are facing these really complex challenges, like, for example, I was talking with somebody who's been doing a lot of work around net zero transition for their airline. They're a leader in an airline, and they can see that the way fuel stuff moving, it's an existential threat to their business, but they can also see it's completely incompatible for them not to step in to the challenge that is airline-based emissions. And so where systems thinking is helping them is it has allowed them to hold a big goal that they don't know how to reach, to say, we're going to become a carbon neutral airline. It allows them to hold that goal without having to have the roadmap from the beginning. And then it allows them to say, okay, well, if that's our goal, if that's our North Star, how do we start moving towards that? What are the things that we have to change now? Or what can we do next? And that's always the big question I encourage people to ask when you're taking a systemic view, is like, well, what can we do next? Because with these systems, we're so used to in business and in private sectors thinking we have to know the whole way, and that we use the past to tell us how to solve the future. And it's just like a totally different way of thinking. And I've actually found system stuff is really liberating for people. So it allows them to hold a big goal without knowing how they're going to get there. It gives a lots of permission, but a challenge to work with others, to stop saying, I've got to solve this on my own. You can't become a carbon neutral airline on your own. You're going to have to work with, I don't know, your airport contractors and your supply chain and your government and your regulator. And it allows people to say, oh yeah, we don't have to do this on our own. We can't do it on our own, and we don't have to. So I think it's really helpful in creating the mandate for more collaborative forms of working. And it allows people to get a bit excited and inspired and create meaning. People in these organizations, they feel these issues in their lives, whether it's like, living in communities where there's a lot of inequality, or, dealing with, political discourse that's really, feels really polarizing. Like, we're humans, people feel this, and systems thinking can allow organizations to create meaning for people, actually, about, hey, we as an organization can step into this space in an appropriate way, in a way that we do have a mandate for. So yeah, those three things, probably: holding big visions, creating compelling kind of sense of meaning, and collaborating, that need to see yourself as an ecosystem player and work with others. Let me share an example from a piece of work called Generation Africa that we were involved in. And this was actually, it's a really cool collaboration between a really big media company based out of Zimbabwe, but a national, continent-wide media company, and a big fertilizer firm as well. And they asked themselves, the fertilizer firm asked itself the question, actually said, well, what's the future of agriculture on the continent? And, fundamentally, what's the future of our market? And they recognized that one of the challenges with, roughly 60% of people in Africa are still dependent on agriculture. And if you want to both tackle poverty, raising smallholder farmer incomes is a big piece of that. If you want to tackle nutritional load, increasing nutritional quality of food is a big part of that. And if you want to respond to and tackle some of the drivers of climate change, or particularly actually respond to the drivers of climate change, food systems are a really important part. But they said that, they said there's a systemic issue that kind of young tech savvy people are not going into agriculture. It's not seen as a desirable industry. And they were saying, you know what, we need more of those people bringing their brilliance, bringing their brilliance and their ideas into this sector to help it grow and reform. So how do we do that? Now, I think the sort of traditional linear approach was to say, well, tell you what, let's set up some sample farm, some pilot farms to practice some things. Let's identify maybe a university where we can go and sponsor a department, or let's find a small cohort of people and sort of train them up. Let's kind of get in there and solve that problem. But particularly through working with this media partner, they took quite a different approach, which is to say, well, those people are out there, actually. There's just not a lot of them, and we don't hear their stories. So how do we elevate their stories? How do we make those people more visible? How do we make the amazing things they're doing, like making ice cream from soldier ants and bug-based foods, for example, and some technology-based innovations as well. How do we make those things more visible? How do we celebrate those people? How do we use them as the catalysts of change? And they launched a whole piece called Generation Africa, which does a whole set of things. But one of the sort of most, the standout pieces is a sort of food prize that they do each year. But then they do a set of pieces about helping those people to meet investors and access capital and get capital ready. So I guess the systemic part there was to look at the whole picture. It wasn't just about kind of creating stories and narratives. It was also about access to finance and access to other things in the supply chain and access to networks, actually, and ability to go from a national player to a sort of regional, so access to market. So they looked at the whole piece and they said, well, given who we are, where are we best placed to intervene, and how do we stimulate others to also step into this whole space around agri-entrepreneurs? So I think that was a really good example of both looking at the problem from a systems point of view, but also being ready to act as a systemic actor, which was to say, again, where this traditionally kind of the private sector player might have said, well, how do we own this and control it? And how do we meet these people? They said, well, who do we need to work with? In this case, actually, the media company was all about going, well, how to talk to kind of this young population. And it's a very young population, continent-wide. We don't know how to do that, actually. We know how to sell products, but we don't know how to do that. So you create these unlikely partnerships with people not trying to hold it all together for themselves, so seeing the interconnections, not trying to work on it on their own, and actually creating something that felt galvanizing and future focused, and was actually about elevating the people that were already there doing the good work, putting those agri-entrepreneurs at the front, not putting the sort of the companies involved at the front, but putting those the people that were meaningful at the front of the whole enterprise. So it is a paradigm shift. It is a different way of thinking the systems piece, and I think it's a both and. There's still a good place for reductionist engineering type thinking in organizations. We shouldn't, every problem is not a complex problem, but what will it take for organizations to embrace that more systemic view? I think there's a the biggest shift is to stop thinking you can do it all on your own. And there's a liberation in that to think, oh, I don't have to, as an organization, solve this stuff alone, whether it's diversity and inclusion, whether it's social equity, whether it's climate change. You don't have to do it on your own, and you can't. So I think the biggest piece is for organizations, as businesses, we're often encouraged to kind of, see our parameters, to stay within them. We have, we like to keep things a bit secretive. We like to hold on to things like intellectual property. There's a whole set of things that are kind of like a mindset of like, hunker down or control as well. How do I control my supply chain? And I think the fundamental piece is to say, I'm a player in this system, so there's some things I can do, and there's some things I'm legitimate to do, and there's some contribution I can make, but I don't have to do all of it. So how am I going to connect with other people who can shift things? How am I going to bring what I've got to the table? And there is probably a slight boldness about being a bit more kind of open and collaborative in tackling these problems that have no single owner, no one organization or institution, however well intentioned, can solve any of these, big issues that we face on their own. I think some sectors are probably more, they can feel their integration a bit more, but what I've really noticed is I found individual leaders and maybe cultures that are more open to it, and often those people that are more open to it are, they're often people who are less motivated by kind of their own kind of professional ascent. Often they are actually quite senior people, and I've had lots of conversations with people going, oh, I've done quite well, I've got here, but what am I going to do with this platform that I've got? But I think it is quite hard to bring this systems view in. Systems leadership is no place for heroes. Lots of people have to act, lots of people have to do lots of things. We don't tend to have kind of people at the end of some systemic change where everyone goes, it was them that did it. So that collaborative way of working does require people who are a little bit less attached to their own prominence within something. And so, you know, when I meet those people, that's when I know I'm in the right space for systems change. I think it's when organizations or individuals really do see how they are part of they know that their success is tied up with other people's, and they're willing to be quite generous into that. They're willing to sort of act first and act with generosity and demonstrate that they are committed to working collaboratively. And that takes a bit of boldness sometimes. And I think sometimes, you know, as we saw in the pandemic, a bit of a threat state when people realize I can't do this on my own. Like, my organization is vulnerable because of the choices and things that are happening outside there, and I have to step out of my organization. I have to work with these other people. I mean, you know, the thing about the pandemic where we all found that the economy is a subset of the health system, you know, those pieces. So I think that threat state is actually probably part of the puzzle as well. So maybe sectors like food are a bit more open to some of this collaborative ways of working, because they can just see that the ability to grow and transport and manufacture food is being massively impacted by climate change. Not will be, is right now. So practical tips and recommendations for people to integrate kind of systemic approaches. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, have a look at Wasafiri's SystemCraft model. It will help, and it's all free. Give it away because we want to resource others. So I think the first thing I actually see is people getting a bit purist and thinking, oh my gosh, if I can't be a full systems practitioner in all that I do every day, it's not good enough, and I have to, you know, and then they're just getting a bit of a doom loop of knowing best but not doing anything differently. So I'd say be imperfect, as in do what you can, push your practice, push your organization a little bit, find windows of opportunity to bring more systemic things in, or systemic ways of thinking about things. I was with somebody last week who's a CEO in a big a bank and insurance firm, and she was like, oh, it's like you're into swim lanes. You know, at work you're often in the swim lane of like, you know, we need results in 12 months, like give us the roadmap, give us the plan, and that swim lane's always going to be there. And then she was like, there's a systemic change swim lane. And I think it's the ability to sort of be in both of those swim lanes. It's to say, oh, I've got to deliver some stuff. You know, there's boundaries. How can I help do it in a way that's it's a bit more likely to shift the underlying conditions, or builds more collaborations as we're doing this bounded thing? So I think for many leaders and practitioners, I would say stop seeing it as two totally separate things. See it as swim lanes you're tacking in between, or you're trying to get to overlap, because the realities of work will always ask you to work with some boundaries. And then, yeah, I'd say have a, you know, our SystemCraft stuff has been designed to help exactly pragmatic people go, what does it really mean to change these conditions? What are the conditions I could look at? You know, how do I change? We talk about collaboration. How do I wire a system together better? How do I create ambition and milestones? How do I create stories that really matter? Looking at incentives is often a big part that people don't look at, like what's driving the current state. If I was going to give anything to people, I'd give them the question, in what ways is the current state working? Because that's where the resistance to change will sit. And we just don't tend to look there very often. So look at the incentives that drive the current state. And also, we talk about harnessing collective intelligence, which is it's about seeing who's the change agents in here. And when you imagine the change agents to be a much larger group of people, not your team, but the whole organization, and how do you push information and insight and knowledge out to them? Like, that's when you can be cracking on in your reductionist swim lane, but actually doing something that stimulates wider change. One of the things with systems is we never understand the full system, and it's not it's not an individual that has it. There's no perfect picture of it, and you're constantly updating that as you work. You know, the act of change teaches you about the system, and the system's shifting all the time. So I think some people do get caught in a like, I've got to get the perfect map of the system, and it's only perfect when I've understood it. So I think that can be a doom loop that people can go into, and organizations can go into, and projects can go into. That said, you know, an awful lot of rubbish happens because, you know, people jump to solutions far too quickly and they start solving something that they haven't even began to understand. I mean, you know, the world is full of great solutions to the wrong problem, that have mostly, you know, at best achieve nothing and at worst make things worse. So, you know, probably my plea to the world would be a little bit more time spent on understanding the problem. And I think the quickest way to do that is actually just to ask really different people with really different perspectives on this, on the problem or on the issue, on the system. And that's where you most quickly, you know, get different insights. My partner works in the NHS, and when you're constantly looking at, you know, how the national health system here in the UK and how do you do appointments and appointment scheduling and make availability, well, one of the biggest drivers of that is bus timetables. And that's because the majority of people who access health services are older people, and bus passes in the UK work from 9:30. So you won't see that if you're doctors and medics and all that. If you just keep asking those people, you won't see that. It's only when you start asking patients, when you start asking older patients, that you see a piece of this system. So I think a lot of people could get a lot further by just asking going, who would have a totally different perspective than me on this issue, and seeking that perspective. And you don't need loads of time to do that, and you don't need loads of resources to do that. Okay, motivational quote. I'm not great one on my motivational quotes, but I'll share one I was using last week that came from a rather brilliant woman I was working with. And she said, blimey, you can do anything when you don't care who gets the credit.